Thank you all for coming here and welcome to Ahmed Naji's reading. My name is Xueyi Zhou. I'm a writer from mainland China, currently a second year fiction MFA in the creative writing program at UNLV. Also, fiction co editor at Witness Magazine and development assistant at Black Mountain Institute. On behalf of the Black Mountain Institute, thank you to the Rogers Foundation and the College of Liberal Arts for making events like these possible. And now, please take this moment to silence your phones. For tonight, Ahmed will read excerpts from his forthcoming book, Rotten Evidence Reading and Writing in Prison, coming out in October this year from Max Weenie's. And in between, he would talk about the process of translating the book and trying to find a publisher. Then the reading will be followed by discussion and questions from the audience. A few of our upcoming events and opportunities: an evening with Imam Mirzo, an Egyptian poet, essayist, translator, and literary scholar in this very same room, the Goldfield Room, on April 21st, and a reading by Sally Denton, author of The Colony, in RLL 101 on May the 3rd. Also this Friday, April 14th at 12 p.m., we have a virtual event, Apply Yourself, Advice for Getting into Residencies and Workshops, with Lance Cleland, the Executive Director of Tin House Workshops. You can check out and RSVP those events at our website, blackmountaininstitute.org. With you, we'd first like to acknowledge that UNLV operates from the city of Las Vegas, traditional homeland and unceded territory of the Nuvuvi or the Moapa Band of Paiute people. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in shared stewardship of the land, in active learning about historical realities of colonialism and the indigenous peoples who continue to work and live on this land since time immemorial. Our reader tonight, Ahmed Naji, is a writer from Egypt currently living in Las Vegas. In 2016, Ahmed was sentenced to 2 years for publishing his novel, Using Life. His imprisonment marks the first time in modern Egypt that an author has been jailed for work of literature. Among his works are more than 6 books, most of which have been translated into different languages. Ahmed has won several prizes and grants throughout his career, including the PEN Barbey Freedom to Write Award, the Open Eye Award, and AFAC grants. His film For Vegas won the Best Documentary Feature in 2023 DC Independent Film Festival and will be screened on April 16th at the Beverly Theater. For more about his work, please visit ahmednaji.net, not .com. That's a different Ahmed, by the way. I never expected in my lifetime that I would meet a writer from Egypt, but hey, we're in Vegas, we have the pyramid here, and so of course everything makes sense. I liked him right away. It was the kind of recognition between 2 international writers, to make it sound fancy, or non-native speakers, certified by the fact that we had to take language proficiency tests to get into schools here. The recognition of that constant struggle we share to find the English words that keep slipping away like sand between fingers, the self-consciousness or embarrassment during the pauses, the regret of you will never know how smart I sound in my own language. Wittgenstein once said, the limits of my language means the limits of my world. Well, for us, the limits start from the very beginning. It is a test, as any writer's journey is filled with tests, either the trials he was forced into because of his novel, Using Life, or TOEFL, the notorious English proficiency test, or navigating the strange world of publishing in the US, which Ahmed would get into later. All of these are things you would come out of stronger, but more often than not, just make whoever comes out more battered and tired, and make them wonder if being a writer actually means being a professional test taker. In case anyone's wondering, the answer is yes. But Ahmed's passion, humor, and wisdom persist and shine. Maybe I'm biased, but at least to me, the language barrier makes his sincerity more urgent. because for him, only important words come out instead of filling the room with meaningless syllables. When I told him I felt stuck with my own writing, he said to me, "Don't live in fear and write the story that also writes you," as quote from his email with consent. Writing does magic in recreating the narrative that shapes us. When I told him his film for Vegas, his love letter to the city, made me emotional too. That feeling of always ready to pack up your life in a suitcase, that growing attached to a place is such a bittersweet because permission to stay is out of control. He said, "Welcome to the journey." It is a journey indeed, in the sense that it takes stops but never ends, and all we do really is to push. And there's nothing better one can ask for than someone like Ahmed along the way, whom I have the luck and I'm proud to call a friend, who I secretly consider a lighthouse, who cares about you and the world, who can give you power simply by being there. And now is the moment when you all do this. Please make it loud and make it long to welcome Ahmed Naji.
Hello. Thank you, Xueyi, for the heartwarming introduction. This should be a poem, by the way, Ahmed Naji poem. Thank you all for being here. Day 21, Saturday, March 12, 2016. Most of my cellmates are inordinately interested in their dreams. It's the main topic of conversation. People tell their dreams to trusted confidence, hoping for an interpretation. Or someone will shout across the cell to a cellmate that they have seen a blazed vision of them in their dreams. Dreams are a glimpse of hope, a window into the outside world. At least, that's what they say in Europe and advanced places like that. But in Egyptian prisons built by our British colonizers, dreams take on far more complex dimensions, which overlap and intermingle with the core of religious faith. Surat Yusuf, the story of Joseph, is the prisoner's constant companion and most prisoners' favorite surah in the whole Quran. Injustice and imprisonment are the basic subject of the story. Yusuf, victim of conspiracy by his brothers, is exiled to Egypt. There, he falls victim to another conspiracy and is thrown in prison because his beauty and chastity send the women of Egypt wild. In prison, he and his cellmates have no window from which to look out into the world save their dreams. Two cellmates dream, and Yusuf interprets. One will die, and another will earn a great favor with the king. Being a prophet, Yusuf's interpretation proved correct. The cellmate who survives becomes advisor to the king. Sometime later, the king has an obscure recurring dream, and the advisor remembers Yusuf, his old cellmate, and counsels the king to have him released from prison. Yusuf or Joseph is freed and is himself made advisor to the king and the chancellor of all Egypt treasury. Now, in position of power, he's able to strike back against his brothers and avenge himself of everything he has lost in life. The story has inspired prisoners across the world and throughout the ages. They see themselves in Yusuf, wronged like he was, or imagine themselves as Yusuf's companions. Prisoners fall asleep fervently, hoping for a vision that will bring a good tidings. Here in prison, dreams aren't a confused model. They are the very core of one's conviction. We go to our bunks at night expecting visions, waiting to find out what will happen, and incautiously, sorry, and incautiously hoping the news will be good. Our greatest wish is to dream. We are cupbearers to the king. Our greatest fear is to dream. We are crucified, and the birds are picking at our heads. So what I just read is an excerpt from my upcoming book. When I arrived here in 2019, I had this book in Arabic as a draft, but it was through my first year at BMI, City Asylum Fellowship, that I was able to focus only on this heavy project and to work closely with my Arabic editor to build the book. So for the first year, I will come to BMI and enter the room and working and involving in conversation with editor, all this happening in Arabic. In the meantime, my BMI colleague will check on me and, oh, what are you working on? And then I will start to explain. But then you are explaining it in English. I felt there is a gap. I was now living in Las Vegas, where English is dominated. To cross this gap, to introduce myself as a writer, I needed my work to be translated into English, but I didn't know where to start. So the book itself led the way. Catherine Halls, a British translator who translated several famous Arabic books like Raga al-Alam, The Dove Necklace, and so on, reached out to me and sent me a lovely letter about how much she loved the book and would love to translate it. I thanked her and said that is something I like to do and I trust her with my work. However, I have one condition, that I don't want to publish my book with an academic publisher or university press. So my previous book, Using Life, was published with university press. And after living here for a couple of years, I started to see how this is very rare also, when you enter a bookstore and you found like a translated book in English from Arabic, usually, or most of the time, it's published by university press. And I wasn't satisfied by how Arabic literature represented here in the publishing industry and in the book market for many reasons. Now, Orientalism and Arabic culture representation in USA is another topic. Maybe we'll have another session about it. But from my personal experience, I felt a big part of it because most of the Arabic literature book and novels were published by university presses, where books are translated by academics who work under the title of Middle East Studies, who read Arabic literature only as a way to understand the society and its political fabric, not to appreciate the art in the writing. It also limits the book access to the market, as university presses usually are understaffed and facing yearly budget cuts. They can't afford to spend that much in marketing and promoting the book. And of course, they can't compete with like the big publishers here who deal with billions and billions of dollars. Translating book also cost. So it's not enough that Catherine was interested in the book. Catherine needed to be paid for her work. So through this time and through conversation with Zhou Shenk and Daniel Gambini, the idea of publishing excerpt from the book in the magazine, The Believer, came up. Me and Catherine thought it would be a great opportunity, and we start to dream big dreams about this plan. Well, The Believer magazine is going to pay Catherine for her translate, and we are going to publish this excerpt, and then we are going to use it to build like a proposal file, and start to approach agents and publisher and so on. But when we start working on the excerpt, I was faced which part of the books that I'm going to translate and publish on The Believer. And I felt there is a need to build a bridge between the experts that I'm going to publish and the English reader. I felt the book topic and its story seems far away, and I needed to build this gap. To do so, I started reading about censorship history in USA. the prison system, the lecture trials, and it struck me how most of these cases are working the same way. Like it's the same technique that happened with me was happening in all these lecture trial cases from James Joyce in 1921 until now, with cases that's going now to ban books from library. And usually it starts like that. Someone will complain that they are offended by the text, or it hurts their children by introducing them to unauthorized ideas. That person then will take the text, the writer, and the publisher to the court. For example, in the case of Ulysses, which officially called United States vs. one book called Ulysses by James Joyce, during 1921, the prosecutor attorney general, for example, will angry announced in the court, in the trial, announced he was going to read an extract from the novel out loud to establish before the court that it posed a threat to society and morality. Protesting that there was no need to subject the court to such obscenity, the judge stopped him. The same scene happened on my case, for example. The prosecutor will try to push to read part from the novel out and loud. Now, back to written evidence and another reading. Anti-Manifesto. Endowed with tongues of fire, writers will defend themselves with every word they utter. But when they come before the law, they are stripped of their power. They cannot use their language because that language is proof of their guilt. The law itself is highly coded language, and the right to use it is granted only to those whose credentials permit them to enter the palace of the law. Even if language is your bread and butter, once inside the palace of the law, you will need a translator. Your translator is the attorney you hire to defend you. As the writer attacks and parries, engaged in fast-moving and ever-changing court battle, even long-held convictions are called into questions. Without the critique of their peers and the time to review and reconsider their work, a writer does not grow and develop. Defending one's work over the course of a trial becomes embarrassing. A year down the line, less even, you might find you have totally changed your mind about what you have written. I have always found interviews with the media excruciating, pressing me to explain my work. Journalists seem to assume that writers understand the full dimension of the writing process. They don't realize that writing itself a way to understand, a way to doubt and questions. Forced to defend myself, I always felt like the defense itself became a prison in which my relationship with literature was confined. I became trapped in a cage, which they and I had constructed out of 6 obscenities, taboos, and my conflict with censorship. How are you going to get out of this one, Ahmed? I asked myself. Do battles like this even come to the end? Or are they just wars of attrition that drag on forever? And what about the third flower? Where was I going to put the third flower? So the expert was published as The Believer and in English, and the feedback was great, it was amazing. And me and Katrina started to get our hope to found a publisher for the book. So we prepared like a proposal file, and we start sending it to publisher. Of course, we didn't receive any response from any publishers. Then we started to reach out to agents. most of them will be like replying the typical agent reply, well, I like the work, but it's not what I'm working on, it's not what I'm interested in. Now, here is something that we need to understand about the economic of translation. An agent, as we know, take a percentage from selling other people work. So translating books cost are a writer fees, advance or reality, a translator who gets paid for translation, and a percentage from realities. So the agent is sharing his percentage for these two. Add to that the language barrier, because most of those agents barely speak one language. So they have, so there is this language barrier between them and any other language. And of course, this is make it hard for them to even build a connection with the text, especially if it's in Arabic. Another thing also that only exists here in the United States, that is the lack of like government or institute fund for translation, which is something exists all over the world. It's funny that the United States government, for example, support translating and publishing American literature and other work, but doesn't support other work to be translated in English. For example, since 2003 until now, the American embassy spent up to $10 million in supporting publishing industry in Arabic world and translating English and American literature into Arabic. But no in the other side. So the scene that we have now, we have a publishing industry here in this country that's guaranteed $25 billion, according to the 2020 annual report released by the Association of American Publishers. But only they will publish yearly up to 600 translated books. So after a year of failing attempt, we couldn't find an agent, we couldn't find a publisher, that even Catherine started to think of herself becoming an agent. Suddenly, I received an email from an Arabic publisher in Egypt, from my Arabic publisher in Egypt. He told me, well, I was in Frankfurt Book Fair and I met this American publisher and she reached out to me and she seems interested in the book. So I was like, wow, interesting. So he forwarded to me the email. I checked their website. It was a very small publishing house in LA that will publish 1 or 2 books. And I noticed that most of these books are translated from Russia or different language. So I said, well, it's a good opportunity. We have a meeting with her, me and Catherine, and in the second meeting, she mentioned, well, I don't have money for the book. So like, okay, what is the plan? She was like, so she suggested, well, what about if we made like a due publishing? She said, I have a connection with the British publishing houses, so I approach them, try to sell to them the book. Then we have 2 editions, a British edition and American edition. And me and Catherine were like, wow, this seems a great deal. So she said, well, you have to sign this contract, which was barely like half page. And when I read it, I understand, well, I'm giving her the authority to speak on my behalf with other publisher. That's what I thought. We signed this contract, which was for a year. And then after 6 months, nothing happening. Like when you call here, oh, I'm going to have a meeting with this publisher, blah, 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 and so on. Meantime, my dear friend and editor who worked with me on the experts that was published at The Believer, Daniel Gambrini, through him, I received an offer from Xueyi. So I went back to this pirate publishers and told her, well, I think I found a publisher and I'm interested in this. And she was like, well, so it's you or Xueyi have to pay me now $2,000, $2,000. To terminate the contract. So after a long and distressed negotiation, finally she agreed to terminate the contract for $500, which I paid. The lesson learned, don't walk alone into the American publishing jungle because wolves are always hungry. After we start working with McSweeney, and with McSweeney, and this because of Daniel, built a system. The system was like, well, Catherine will translate, and Daniel was going to be an editor. And after calculation, we were even like short on $2,000 or $3,000. Like McSweeney was going to pay me the fees and everything, and they are going to pay Catherine and Daniel, but we are short, like they are short in like 2,000 or 3,000. So it was through BMI and through Beverly Rogers Foundation that we were able to secure this 2,000 finally, and we signed the deal. Now we start working on the translation. And in the time during the translation, many questions started to come up. For example, one of the things that is very essence in my style in Arabic, that's the way that I'm moving between first person and second person and even third person in the same paragraph. Like the sentence usually with me will go like, oh, I went to the supermarket and I picked up the milk. Do you remember the milk when you were young? You see, so I'm always moving between the first, second person. And and in this book in Arabic, this structure was embedded in it. It was so much. And Catherine was like, well, translating it into English, it will make the book hard to read and it will make it more complicated. And she showed me in best symbol, and we didn't like. So the first decision that we are going to cut the third person from most of the book pieces. The second thing that Catherine is a British, and we made a deal that the book is going to be in American English. So it was Daniel's first job to make the book English. Of course, for me, it was impossible to understand what is British and what's American, because for me, it's all exists in the dictionary. So when I open the dictionary, it's there. Like, for example, one of this, there was a lot of example, but one of those example, when I talk about prison guards, Catherine will translate it into screws. And of course, like Daniel was like, what is that? Why you are calling them like this? And she was like, well, it's a famous nickname for prison guards. But here, like, it doesn't exist. So we had to work on this first. After the book being translated, I told Daniel, deal with it as it's like a totally English book. So, and feel free in editing. We don't have to be 100% connected to the Arabic book, because I wrote this Arabic book to the Arabic reader, but this book is intended to English reader. So Daniel came up with a lot of recommendation, like, for example, changing how the book is structured. We moved a lot of part from the end of the book to the beginning, or the beginning to the end, and so on. And then there was a lot, one of the things also we talked about, that we don't need a glossary. We made an agreement that we are not going to have a glossary on the book. Usually when you read translated book, you found there is a glossary in the end. And I thought we are in a time that passed this traditional, because now if someone saw a word and they don't understand it, they simply could search it on the internet. But also I didn't want to force anyone while they're reading, like, to search for their words. So we needed to change some cultural reference that I mentioned. We needed to change some structure. Some also information for Arabic or Egyptian readers, they know it. Like, for example, when I was in the prison, I found my friend and my colleague, my neighbor, my mentor, Ala Saif, who is in prison now in Egypt for more than 10 years. And I know him like since 23. He was with me in the same prison. So in the book, I don't talk about Ala, because like everyone know about my relation with Ala. I wrote about him and so on. So in the book, I didn't talk that much about him, but I mentioned him. I mentioned, oh, I met Ala, and he told me so. Now, Daniel and Catherine were like, well, people will not understand, will not know who's Ala. By the way, a collection of his article was translated into English and published last year under the title, "You Are Not Being Defeated Yet." So I ended up wrote like 3,000 words that didn't exist in the Arabic version. Now, this is going to be the last part. Humiliation. One morning, we were woken up early and told to put our uniforms and leave the cell block. I opened my eyes. It was barely 6 a.m. All I could make out from the matters of my cellmates was that there was a prison authority inspection. Movement and muffled voices filtered in from outside, and the unfamiliar sound of dogs barking. I headed to the lavatories to wash my face and was standing in line for the sink when two plainclothes officers I would never seen before burst in, yelling at us to get out as they yanked open the curtains to each stall, kicked the trash cans over, and then dumped the pots and pans we used for cooking into the trash that now covered the ground. I followed the others out, trying to avoid being seen by either of crazed officers. On my way to the door, I suddenly remembered the manuscript of my novel. Pretending to take a long slug from the plastic water bottle on my bed, I whipped the notebook out from under the mattresses and quickly slid it into my bags of clothes. I don't know why that seemed a better hiding place. I guess I just thought a notebook in a bag would arouse less suspicion than a notebook under mattresses. The prison authority carried out surprise inspections every 3 months or so. The prison administrations never know when it would be. A squad from prison authority reporting directly to the Ministry of Interior descended without warning and simply took over the warden and his lieutenants. They reviewed the registers and paperwork, took all the keys, and went through every single cell. For the duration of the inspection, the prison was under the control of jailers we didn't know. An officer in civilian clothes and a young lieutenant who held the inmate ID cards stood, waiting as we fled out of our cells for the roll call. They checked that the card matched the prisoner by half calling. The officer would shout the first part of your full name, and you had to reply with second part. Ahmed Hijazi, yelled the officer. Saleh Nagy, I shouted back. But the lieutenant stopped me, glanced down at the card in his hand. What are you in for? For writing, sir. What? Fighting? No, sir, writing. I'm a journalist and I wrote something. It says here, gross violation of decency. That means you raped or assaulted someone. No, sir, it was a gross violation of public decency. Not a woman? No, sir. Not a child? No, sir, just the public. I was shoved into a corner, and we were ordered to squat or sit on the ground. One man remained standing, and the young lieutenant blowed at him to get down. He protested weakly that he had a problem with his knees, but before he could even finish the sentence, the lieutenant whacked him on the face, and he crumbled to the floor. They brought sniffer dogs who inspected us thoroughly before being taken through to the cell block. On the first floor, where they kept the guys who were in for drugs and violent offenses, it was much more vicious. All we could hear was shouting and cursing, and the sound of mattresses and the blankets being slashed apart with knives. One group of prisoners were made to strip and stand facing the wall. We were kept there for about 4 hours. I spent the whole time willing myself to disappear. Violence like that had no reason or justifications. It was a show of force, an unabashed delight in the pleasure of humiliating others. They really were dogs, rabid dogs, who tore up everything in their path as they hunted for contraband. Contraband could be pills, but it could also be a metal teaspoon or a glass or an electric kettle or an electronic device. The regime's dog feed on humiliation. If their eyes fall upon you for some reason and they took disliking to a movement you made or the way you looked, they could make an example out of you in front of everyone. And when that happened, you had to submit. Because any hint of resistance was a provocation. Your resistance signaled that there was something inside you that wasn't broken yet, and their job was to break it. Your chance of winning was zero. There are all kinds of rabid dogs in this falling apart track of country. Usually, it's the freshly graduated police lieutenants or officers in the criminal investigations units. But it could be any crazy fucker with a gun. The sense of terror the dogs provoke doesn't go away. It's still with me. I learned a lesson that day, but that didn't stop me forgetting it again. Later, in the Khalifa police station, where I was transferred shortly before my release, a lieutenant and one of the crazy fucker types of officers came in and ordered us to stand facing the wall with our hands up. For some reason, I just couldn't stop myself glancing out of the corner of my eye at the lieutenant as he made his way to the cell. The smack to my face came out of nowhere. He dragged me backwards away from the wall, then pushed me forwards, so I smashed heavily into it. Then did the same things twice more, cursing the whole time. I made myself still and didn't resist at all. Didn't let my face show any reaction. Didn't even reach up gently finger my raw and swollen forehead. That was the humiliation, and it worked. The officer moved on and slapped another prisoner, who was standing with his weight on one leg. It happened again at the last stop before my release, Bulaq police station, when a lieutenant, another fresh graduated, caught me smoking. He opened the wire mesh door and whacked me around in the face, then dragged me, shaking and apologizing, out of the cell. I remember thinking at that time, I am not going to write about this. I am not going to tell anyone. If I do, I will make it a black comedy. I will add preposterous hyperbole for extra laughs and show horn in some dramatic conflict between the social classes who are imprisoned cheek by jowl in cramped cell. How do you even write about being humiliated without making yourself the heroic underdog? The sense of abasement I feel is too bitter to make a melodrama. I thought, when you are humiliated and broken, writing wouldn't fix it. When they finally let us go back to the cell block, the entire contents of our cell were scattered on the ground. I found my clothes under a bag of tomatoes and a cucumber. And they would confiscated our metal coffee pot and our improvised tuna can ashtray. But they hadn't touched the box or my manuscript. Thank you all.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Ahmed, for the amazing reading. And now we're going to open to discussion and questions from the audience. And I'm going to open with two questions of myself because I'm that selfish. Um, so, first, about the extra 3,000 words that you mentioned that were not in the original version. Could you talk a bit more about that besides changing the words and the cultural references? What was the extra content about, and what makes you decide to put that into the English version?
So this wasn't. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. So this wasn't my first translated book or text, but the difference that before I was a writer living in Egypt, writing in Arabic. So this was my main focus. A translator or publisher will come and like what I wrote and want translated, and I totally will work with the translators that I trust, and I leave it to them. Like for example, the translation of Using Life, it's the same. It's all Benjamin Kruber's work. But the difference that I'm no longer living there. There is no soon return. I start to adapt to like my new life and my new identity as an immigrant. And part of it is living here with English. So I didn't want to end in this situation because my situation is not unique. Like the history of writers who were forced to leave their countries and here is repeated. And usually there is two paths, writers who will come to America or the exiled country and continue writing in their original language and writing about the same theme. And I met some of this here, like I met people and writer who like I will sit with them and they are Egyptian and they will tell me like details about what's happening in Egypt, but they don't know what is happening in the streets they are living or in New York City where they are living or so on. And I didn't want this situation. I want to be involved in what I am. I wanted to build a conversation with people around me. I think I was very lucky comparing to other writer who had to leave Egypt and flee in the last 10 years because I came here as City Asylum Fellowship and BMI. So I was suddenly surrounded by all this amazing writer and people, and through conversation with them and through reading, I start to build my sense of English and my sense of writing. So when Catherine like translates a book and I was able to read it in English, I read the details. I now like have an idea and have a feeling about each word in English. What does it mean? Not only the meanings that exist in the dictionary, but like the meaning in the slang or culture or so on. So when I was reading the translating and that Catherine did and working with Daniel, it was also for me a training on writing in English. So that's what lead me like to change and add more and work on it. And through also research, I discovered this process of changing the book is very common, but writers who are doing it don't talk about it. Like for example, Haruki Murakami novel in Japanese is so different from the ones that published in English. And usually the English translation is the one that it will be translated worldwide. I found that some of his novel will have like more than 100 pages in Japanese that doesn't exist in the English. So I thought to discover this path as a way of like training myself on writing and approaching English reader.
Thank you, thank you. And that kind of brings me to my second question of the audience. I think that is something that often dominates every writer's mind. Like, who is this audience? Who is this reader we're supposed to write for? You mentioned that you had struggles trying to connect yourself with the American or the English readers audience in general as an exile writer across language and cultural barriers. And what were your initial worries and concerns? And how does your experience of working with a translator and now having a book coming out soon change your idea of this English reader? And do you still have the same concerns? And do you have new challenges that with the book it brings?
Yeah, I think we always have it challenging with every book, even if you are writing in English and Arabic. Like you are working on your second book, so you think, oh, does the readers who read my first book will like this or not? Do I make the gambling and changing my style and my work or not? Especially if you have the first book and it will succeed. Some writers will be caged in the succeed of their style. And this is not, for me, this is not how it works. Even in Arabic, like with every book, I try to totally change even the language and the structure. But here, when I moved here, the biggest challenge was to think who I'm writing for. Like, for example, since I moved here, and I have been approached by publisher and newspaper and magazine, and they will ask me, write to us about anything in America, about Vegas. And I couldn't until now writing in Arabic about the United States. Although my first time I arrived here in 2008, I was here covering the Obama election. Like my relation with the United States, that for more than 10 years, I'm what they call an Arabic expert in American policy. But so, and I came to cover election and I came to do documentary movies. But suddenly, because I'm living here and thinking on writing, I start to see things differently. I remember, for example, and this was in DC, this was before moving here. I was visiting a friend in DC. Um, and when I entered his house, I found that he's hanging on the wall a huge metal handcuffs. And I was like, what is that? And he was like, oh, this was my grandfather handcuffs. His grandfather or his great grandfather was a slave, basically, and was African. And this like struck me because, yeah, I will be reading about slavery and about African American here and about segregation, but suddenly I didn't understand like this is like a recent trauma and recent experience, and the effect of it is continued. And suddenly things start to have different weight inside you and different emotional feeling. And the struggle to write this in Arabic. But I want to talk about it in English. But also I don't know what is this audience. So after publishing this book in Arabic, I remember the year 21. This was like one of the worst year in my writing work. Like through this year, I wasn't able to write anything. Until the end of this year, I published a text called Taming Immigrants. And suddenly the reaction and the feedback I received, I was receiving message and long letters. Like I never wrote something and received such a weird feedback, like long letters and email from people in Europe, in Germany, in United States. And some of them are originally, because this text was published in English, some of them will be, oh, they Arabic readers, so they know me from Arabic. But some cases, they will be like Vietnamese, they will be, no Chinese, unfortunately, but they will be from other nationality. And I started to understand that they are all immigrants. And there is a theory in my mind that we are living in a time that we are witnessing waves of millions of people, immigrants all over the world from everywhere. And they are struggle because we inherit this old world of the Second World War, where national states and the border and national identity is so dominated. But we are witnessing, and this is maybe like just in my mind, I think there is a new sense of collective imaginary of immigrants. And it happened to me. It happened to me, for example, when I read books by Vietnamese writers, American Vietnamese writers, and I feel so related and touched by their stories. Not only because of their work, but because it make conversation with questions that I have in my mind. So maybe this is the audience, at least now when I said this is the audience that I think I imagine when I'm writing.